The quilt was made of ghosts. Not the spectral kind that rattled chains, but the quieter sort, the ones that lived in worn patches of indigo cotton from a workman's shirt and frayed squares of silk from a dress worn only once, in a life that no longer existed. Lee held the heavy blanket draped over her arm, the colors muted under the saloon's jaundiced light. Each stitch was a story, a memory of her husband's calloused hands, of a life in a tidy San Francisco home before the railroad accident had made her a widow at 25 and sent her fleeing inland to this parched scrap of Nevada territory. Here, in Dust Devil Gulch, she was just the Chinese woman. A curiosity, a shadow living in a dugout cabin on a homestead claim nobody else had wanted. And today, she was desperate. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the summer sun had been merciless on her small vegetable patch. This quilt, the finest she had ever made, was her last chance before the biting cold of winter began its slow march across the plains. The saloon smelled of stale beer, sweat, and sawdust. It was mid-afternoon, too early for the miners and cowboys who would later fill the room with coarse laughter and violence, but a few tables were occupied. At the largest one, near the grimy front window, sat the women who mattered in the town. Beatrice Croft, wife of the merchant who owned the general store and held the notes on half the town's properties, was holding court. Her laughter was sharp and brittle, like glass breaking. Lee took a steadying breath and approached their table. Her own dress was a faded grey calico, mended so many times the original fabric was a mystery. She felt their eyes on her, cataloguing her foreignness, her poverty. "Pardon me," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I have a quilt for sale." She unfolded the blanket and laid it carefully over the back of an empty chair. The centerpiece was a complex starburst pattern, stitched with thread she had painstakingly dyed herself from wild berries. It was surrounded by squares of varying sizes and fabrics, a map of a life pieced together from remnants. Beatrice Croft leaned forward, her lips pursed in a parody of interest. She touched a patch of dark blue denim with the tip of her gloved finger as if it were something unclean. "And what, pray tell, is this made from?" "Scraps," Lee answered, keeping her gaze steady. "Work clothes. Old linens. Anything strong enough to last." Another woman, whose face was a pinched mask of disapproval, let out a small, derisive laugh. "It looks like a beggar's coat. All those drab colors. My husband wouldn't let such a thing in our house. It might carry a sickness." Beatrice smiled, a slow, cruel curving of her mouth. "Oh, I don't know, Martha. There's a bit of silk here." She pointed to a small, shimmering square of emerald green. "Wherever did you get a piece like this?" The insinuation was clear, hanging in the thick air like cigar smoke. Anneli's hands tightened into fists at her sides, hidden in the folds of her skirt. The green silk was from the sash of her wedding dress. A dress her husband had said made her look like an empress. She did not give them the satisfaction of an answer. She simply stood, a silent statue of resilience, while they picked her life apart, piece by piece. "The stitching is so small and tight," Beatrice mused, her voice dripping with false admiration. "Like something a mouse would do. Is that how they teach you to sew, where you're from?" The laughter that followed was louder this time, confident and dismissive. Lee felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, but she refused to lower her eyes. She had known this would be difficult, but the casual cruelty of it was a physical blow. She began to fold the quilt, the ghosts of her past retreating back into the cloth. She would go. She would find another way. "How much?" The voice was low and gravelly, cutting through the women's laughter and silencing it instantly. It came from the corner of the room, from a table shrouded in shadow. Lee had noticed the man when she entered, only because everyone else in the saloon gave his table a wide berth. He was tall and lean, dressed in dark, dusty clothes. His face was all sharp angles and sun-weathered skin, and a pistol with a worn wooden grip rested low on his hip. She had heard the whispers about him. Silas Kane. A gunslinger, a man who kept to himself and whose business was best left alone. He had not moved, but his question held more weight than all the women's chatter combined. He was looking at the quilt, his eyes a startlingly pale grey in his dark face. Lee hesitated. $5. It was a bold price, more than she had dared to hope for, but the women's scorn had put steel in her spine. Beatrice Croft let out an incredulous scoff. $5? For a bundle of rags? The girl is mad. Silas Kane's gaze shifted from the quilt to Beatrice, and for the first time, Lee saw the cold stillness in his eyes that made hardened men walk on the other side of the street. Beatrice's smile faltered, and she looked away, suddenly finding the contents of her reticule fascinating. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the now silent room. He walked over to the quilt, his spurs ringing softly on the floorboards. He didn't touch it, not at first. He just looked, his eyes tracing the starburst pattern in the center. He seemed to see more than just thread and fabric. He seemed to see the ghosts, too. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and tipped a few coins onto his palm. He held them out to Lee. It was a gold piece and some silver. More than $5. That one, he said, his voice still quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. That's the one I'd keep. He wasn't just talking about the quilt. He was talking to the women, to the whole town. Lee slowly reached out and took the coins, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, calloused, but there was a surprising warmth to his touch. She looked up at him, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes was gone, replaced by something she couldn't name. It looked like recognition. He took the quilt from the back of the chair, folding it with a surprising gentleness for a man whose hands were made for violence. He tucked it under his arm. Without another word to anyone, he turned and walked out of the saloon, the swinging doors sighing shut behind him, leaving Lee standing in a pool of stunned silence, the weight of his gold coin heavy and real in her palm. The women at the table did not look at her. Their laughter was gone, and in its place was a new, wary respect she had not earned, but had been given. She did not yet know that the gunslinger's protection was a far more complicated and dangerous thing than their scorn. She bought flour, salt pork, and beans at the general store, enduring the sour glare of Franklin Croft, Beatrice's husband. The man counted her change with deliberate slowness, his eyes lingering on the gold coin Silas had given her. The purchase left her with a few dollars to spare, a fortune that felt as fragile as a desert flower. As she walked the dusty track back to her homestead, the sun beat down on her head. Her claim was 2 miles out of town, a small plot of land the deed office had described as unforgiving. It was a shallow dugout, dug into the side of a low hill, with a roof of sod and a single window. But it had one treasure the town didn't know about, a small, reliable spring that bubbled up behind the cabin, allowing her to coax a garden from the stubborn earth. She spent the next day weeding that garden, her mind replaying the scene in the saloon. Silas Kane had not just bought her quilt. He had drawn a line in the dust, placing her on his side of it. In a town like Dust Devil Gulch, such an action had consequences. She worked until her back ached, trying to sweat out the unease. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and dusky orange, she saw a rider approaching. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Lone riders at dusk were rarely a good sign. She stood up, wiping her dirty hands on her apron, and reached inside the cabin door for the old, heavy shotgun her husband had left her. She didn't know if she could use it, but the feel of its wooden stock was a comfort. It was Silas. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from her cabin and dismounted. He wasn't carrying the quilt. Instead, he had 2 heavy-looking sacks tied to his saddle. He said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet air. He nodded toward her cabin. I saw you didn't have much of a woodpile started for winter. Lee stared at him, bewildered. You rode out here to tell me that. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. No. I brought you these. He untied the sacks and carried them over, setting them on the ground near her door. One was filled with potatoes, the other with cured hams. It was more food than she'd seen in a year. I can't accept this, she said, though her stomach clenched at the sight of it. I have no way to repay you. You already overpaid for the quilt. It's not a payment, he said, his pale eyes fixed on her face. It's an investment. A woman living alone this far out, you need to be prepared. The winters here are not kind. He paused, then added, that pattern on your quilt. The starburst. My mother used to make one just like it. The words hung in the air between them. It was an offering, a piece of himself laid bare. And Lee found her voice. My grandmother taught it to me. She said it was to guide the spirits of our ancestors home, so they would not get lost on their journey. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. My mother wasn't from here. Her people were from the south. They had stories like that, too. He looked back at her, and the loneliness in his eyes was so profound it felt like a shared secret. She said it was a picture of a life. All the broken pieces, made into something strong enough to keep you warm. He had understood. He had looked at her bundle of scraps and seen not poverty, but a testament to survival. In that moment, he was no longer just the town gunslinger. He was a man who knew what it was to be pieced together from the remnants of a broken past. Thank you, she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. For the food. And for, in the saloon. The Crofts own too much of this town, he said, his voice hardening. They think that gives them the right to own the people in it, too. They're wrong. He stayed for another hour. He didn't come inside her small home, but he took the axe from the stump where it was embedded and, with an economy of motion that was both beautiful and terrifying, chopped a month's worth of firewood from a deadfall cottonwood near the spring. He worked without speaking, and she brought him a dipper of cool water from the spring, which he drank in 3 long swallows. When he was done, he stacked the wood neatly against the side of the dugout. As he prepared to leave, he turned to her. Franklin Croft, so you pay with my coin. He'll be curious about your land now. Watch yourself. The warning settled like a cold stone in her gut. She had known her small spring was a secret worth protecting, but now that secret had a powerful enemy. Silas Kane had bought her a reprieve from public scorn, but he had also painted a target on her back. What he found in her quiet defiance would bring a different kind of trouble to her door. The trouble arrived 3 days later. It came in the form of 2 men, hired hands from one of Croft's ranches. They smelled of cheap whiskey and self-importance. And Lee was tending her garden when they rode up, their horses trampling a row of young carrots. The larger of the 2 men, a burly fellow with a sweat-stained hat, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. Mr. Croft sent us, he announced. He's prepared to make you a generous offer for this piece of dirt. $50. And Lee straightened up, her hands clutching her gardening trowel. $50 was a lot of money, but the land, with its water, was worth 10 times that. It was her future. My claim is not for sale. The second man, who was weaselly and thin, laughed. Now listen here. A woman like you got no business being out here alone. It ain't safe. Mr. Croft is just looking out for you. I am perfectly safe, she said, her voice betraying none of the fear that was coiling in her belly. The big man's smile vanished. That's not what you're supposed to say. You're supposed to take the money and be grateful. He swung himself down from his horse. Maybe we need to show you how unforgiving this land can be. He took a step toward her. And Lee stood her ground. She thought of Silas, of the quiet strength in his eyes. She thought of her husband, and the life they had planned. This patch of earth was all she had left of that plan. The U.S. Marshal in Carson City is a friend of my late husband's family, she said, the lie coming to her in a flash of desperate inspiration. He takes a special interest in my claim. I send him a letter every week by telegraph from town. If he doesn't hear from me by Saturday, he sends a deputy. The man paused, his brow furrowed in thought. The mention of a federal marshal was like a splash of cold water. Territorial disputes were one thing, crossing a U.S. marshal was another. The weaselly man, however, was not convinced. She's bluffing. Maybe, the big man grunted. But I ain't getting my neck stretched over $50 of Croft's money. He seemed ready to leave, but his pride was wounded. He couldn't just ride away. He looked around, his eyes landing on her small, neat rows of vegetables. But we can't leave empty-handed. Before she could react, he walked over to her precious garden and began kicking it apart. He stomped on the squash vines, kicked over the beanpoles, and crushed the ripening tomatoes under his heavy boots. The other man joined in, laughing as he tore her hard work to shreds. It was a calculated act of cruelty, meant to break her spirit, to starve her out. Unli watched, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She didn't scream or cry. She simply stood, the trowel still in her hand, and memorized their faces. This was the cost. This was what it took to hold on to something of your own. When they were finished, the garden was a ruin. They mounted their horses, tipped their hats in a mocking farewell, and rode off, leaving her in a cloud of dust and devastation. She didn't move until they were a speck on the horizon. Then she dropped the trowel and slowly, deliberately, knelt in the dirt. She picked up a single crushed tomato, its seeds and pulp spilling over her fingers. It was the food for the coming winter, destroyed in minutes. Tears finally came, hot and silent. She didn't hear Silas ride up until his shadow fell over her. He dismounted and knelt beside her, his face grim as he surveyed the wreckage. He didn't ask what happened. He knew. He gently took the ruined tomato from her hand and tossed it aside. "This isn't about the land anymore," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "This is about him trying to break you because you wouldn't bend." Unli looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "He will win. I have nothing left." "You have this," he said, touching the ground with his palm. "And you have me." He stood up, pulling her to her feet. "Croft thinks his money makes him a king. But out here, there are other kinds of power." He looked toward the town, his eyes narrowed to slits. "He won't stop. Which means I have to stop him." 3 months later, the first snows of winter dusted the high peaks of the Sierra Nevada, and the air in Dust Devil Gulch had a crisp, clean bite to it. The garden Unli had thought lost was recovering. Silas had helped her replant, using his knowledge of the high desert climate to choose hardier late-season crops. A new, sturdy fence made of juniper posts now enclosed it, a silent warning to anyone who might think of trespassing. The power of Franklin Croft had been broken, not with a gun, but with a piece of paper. Silas had ridden to Carson City. He hadn't gone to see a marshal. He had gone to the Territorial Land Office. There, he had spoken to a clerk about certain discrepancies he had noticed in the way land claims around Dust Devil Gulch were being filed and financed. He mentioned Franklin Croft's name. He also sent a telegraph to a journalist he knew in Sacramento. 2 weeks later, a territorial agent arrived in town to begin an investigation into Croft's lending practices. The fear that had held the town in a chokehold began to dissipate. Men who owed Croft money started talking to the agent. Franklin and Beatrice Croft were now the outcasts, their dinner invitations going unanswered, their greetings met with stony silence on the street. Unli was no longer just the Chinese woman. She was Mrs. Chen, the woman who had stood up to Croft and won. Other women from the town now made the trek out to her cabin, not to mock, but to trade. They brought cured meats and bolts of cloth in exchange for her knowledge of herbs and her well-preserved vegetables. Her quiet courage, backed by Silas's unyielding presence, had woven her into the fabric of the community. On a cold afternoon, Unli sat by the fire in her small cabin, now warm and secure against the coming winter. She was sewing a new quilt, this one a commission for the blacksmith's wife. The colors were bright and hopeful, sunny yellows, deep reds, and sky blues. Silas sat in a chair he had built for her, oiling the leather of his saddle. He rarely spoke of the future, but he hadn't left. He had moved into the small, abandoned line shack on the edge of her property, fixing it up and making it his own. His presence was a quiet, constant source of strength. On a hook by the door hung the first quilt, the one made of ghosts. It was her past, her history, and the thing that had brought this quiet, dangerous man into her life. Silas finished his work and came to stand behind her, watching her fingers fly as she stitched. He reached out and gently traced the starburst pattern on the new quilt. "You make good things," he said. "Strong things." Unli paused her sewing and looked from the bright new quilt to the old, faded one hanging on the wall. She thought of all the broken pieces of her life, the sorrows and hardships that had been stitched together to create this new, unexpected pattern. She had learned that a life, like a quilt, wasn't about the pristine pieces of cloth you started with. It was about what you could build from the scraps you had left. It was about finding the one person in the world who could look at your patches and scars and see not a thing to be pitied, but something to be kept. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.